1831, there was an eclipse of the sun. Nat Turner took this to be the sign he had been promised and confided his plan to the four men he trusted the most: Henry, Hart, Nelson, and Sam. They decided to hold the insurrection on the 4th of July and began planning a strategy. However, they had to postpone the action because Nat Turner became ill. On August 13th, there was an atmospheric disturbance in which the sun turned bluish green. This was the final sign. And a week later, on August 21st, Turner and 6 of his men met in the woods to eat a dinner and make their plans. At 2 o'clock that morning, they set out to the Travis household, where they killed the entire family as they lay sleeping. They continued on from house to house, killing all the white people they encountered. Turner's force eventually consisted of more than 40 slaves, most on horseback. By about midday on August 22nd, Turner decided to march toward Jerusalem, Virginia. To march toward Jerusalem, the closest town. By then, word of the rebellion had gotten out to the whites. Confronted by a group of militia, the rebels scattered and Turner's force became disorganized. After spending the night near some slave cabins, Turner and his men attempted to attack another house, but were repulsed. Several of the rebels were captured. The remaining force then met the state and federal troops in final skirmish, in which one slave was killed and many escaped, including Turner. In the end, the rebels have stabbed, shot, and clubbed at least 55 white people to death. In total, the state of Virginia executed 55 people, banished many more, and acquitted a few. The state reimbursed the slaveholders for their slaves, but in the hysterical climate that followed the rebellion, close to 200 black people, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion, were murdered by white mobs. In addition, slaves as far away as North Carolina were accused of having a connection with the insurrection and were subsequently tried and executed. The state legislature of Virginia considered abolishing slavery, but in a close vote decided to retain slavery and to support a repressive policy against black people, slave and free. You go to the second section on Nat Turner. It says, well, it was talking about Denmark Vesey's revolt, but it discusses Nat Turner. Vesey's revolt was immensely frightening to Southern slave owners. Not only was it difficult to crack the plot, despite the fact that thousands of slaves were involved, but the sheer thoroughness. I won't read that whole section. Neither Prosser's nor Vesey's rebellion actually succeeded. Despite their fear, European Americans believed that in the end, God had protected them. This would all change, however, when a man that slaves simply called prophet, Nat Turner, led a short revolt in which God did not protect slave owners. Turner, like Vesey, was from the upper class of slaves. He had grown up deeply hating slavery. His mother, an African, so hated slavery that she tried to kill him when he was born in 1800 to prevent him from living the life of a slave. Imagine that. He too was religious, in fact, far more than Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser. His Christianity was a religion of visions and mystical experience. By the time he was a young man, Turner had become unofficially the major religious leader in Southampton County in Virginia. Unlike Vesey, Turner's Christianity emphasized not the Israelite deliverance, but the latter days of Christ in Jerusalem and the apocalyptic promise of a new Jerusalem. His rhetoric had a place as well as a spiritual meaning. Jerusalem, Virginia, which lay nearby. Talking about Nat Turner. All of his disciples, 7 of them, were fired by anger and religious passion. One, named Will, had been so abused by his master that he was covered with scars. On the appointed night on Sunday, they left Turner's house and they entered the house of his master, where, with only one hatchet and one broad axe between them, they executed all the members, including 2 teens, with the exception of an infant. They moved then from house to house throughout the night and executed every European American they could find, with the exception of a white family that owned no slaves. Will chopped up his master and wife so passionately that Turner called him Will the Executioner. As they went from house to house, they gathered slaves and weapons. By Monday, they were approaching Jerusalem, but were turned back by a regiment of European Americans. Turner dug a cave and went into hiding, but when troops arrived, they scoured the countryside and executed slaves by the hundreds. Turner, however, was not caught for over 2 months, and during all this time, Virginians were seized with panic. Hundreds fled the county and many left the state for good. Turner, however, was eventually captured and hung. This was the last straw. From this point onwards, no slave owner lived comfortably with slavery now that they understood the anger, the resistance, and the vengeance that boiled beneath the burden of slavery. I might also add, although it's not mentioned here, when they executed Nat Turner, they did so very gruesomely.
Yes,
First
sir.
of all, Nat Turner was beheaded.
Yes, sir.
Then he was flailed. You know what flailing is? That's when you skin a human being. You literally remove the skin. And you know, one of the unknown facts about slavery in the United States was that slave skin was sold on the market. People don't know about that. That there was a market for the skin of human beings. Slave skins were used to make shoes. And there's an episode that I'll bring to you at a later date of 2 colonists. And one colonist proudly referring to his new shoes, which were made with the skins of slaves. And you know, this is all very interesting. And we could go on if the weather would allow, but we can't because a storm is certainly coming. But I can remember as a child at South 17th Street School, which is not far from here on 17th Street between 16th and 18th Avenues. Every year, South 17th Street School, we celebrated Hanukkah. And I like the celebration. Is this correct? The Festival of Lights? Yeah. And doesn't it also mark the struggle of Judas Maccabees against the Syrians? Yeah. Against the Greeks?
Even now, let me just put Zionists like to talk about the Greeks as Syrians. They were Syrian Greeks.
Right.
But it had nothing to do with Syria.
Right. So they were Greeks that the Jews were struggling against. And this was an armed struggle. You know, this was, when they talked about the Messiah, they were referring to some real Messiah that was going to come and liberate them from their oppressors. So the struggle of Judas Maccabees was an armed struggle. So a little African American boy from an African American community in a predominantly black African American school learned about the armed struggle of Jews, but we never learned about Nat Turner's rebellion or any other rebellion of slaves against the oppressors. My first exposure to black history was when finally they recognized Crispus Attucks. And Crispus Attucks was a merchant marine seaman, and he was in on the Boston Commons, and he was with another group, and they were fired upon by British soldiers, and it was taught to us that the first to die in the American Revolution was a black man. So we were taught that it was okay to struggle against the British, to have an armed struggle against British imperialism. But we never, ever learned about any struggle, any armed struggle of African people in this country or any other country. We didn't even learn about the Haitian Revolution in elementary school or in high school. But it just goes to show you how much we have to do. And now that we have the Amistad Act as law in the state of New Jersey, hopefully PTA groups across the state will make sure that it's implemented in their school, because if they do implement the Amistad Act, people will learn about these slave rebellions, and that black people, just as all other people, have a right to take up arms against their oppressors. And there were many slave rebellions. Herbert Apteker points out in his work, in his book, Slave Rebellions in Colonial America, that there were 400 recorded slave rebellions, and that there were many rebellions that were not recorded because there was no way to record them. There were no newspapers of record in certain counties, in certain places in the United States. And the other fact is that slaves were always struggling against slavery, whether it was in open rebellion or in 1,000 other ways. Masters were known to die because their slave cooks would grind up glass and put it in their master's food, and they would poison. There were many ways that slaves rebelled when they were not strong enough to organize armed rebellion. So this is a very important part of our history. We should, and it is a part that has been left out, left blank, because people don't want to talk about violence, at least that kind of violence. It's okay to talk about the American Revolution. It's okay to talk about the Civil War. But, you know, when I was a kid, they taught the Civil War in a way that it didn't even make me understand that this was something that related to me, you know, that this was something that should be important to me. And the fact of the matter is that the Civil War was the greatest of the slave rebellions. The North wasn't winning the war, right? Wade, they weren't winning. That's right. The South had fewer men and fewer resources, but they were defeating the North because in many instances, the Union troops lacked the will to fight because they were not in unity with the abolition of slaves. Many immigrants came over here, and if you saw that movie, The Gangs of New York, right? They literally got off the boat and uniforms were put on them and they were sent down south to fight. And they didn't come to fight. And they burned down Harlem. You know, they burned, yes, was it Harlem? No, they burned down downtown Manhattan because that's where the African community originally was. Where the World Trade Center and all of that is now, that's where the black community was. They, Chambers Street, they burned it to the ground in objection to being drafted to fight in the Civil War. So many of the Union troops lacked the will to fight. And then finally, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Thaddeus Stevens, and others urged Lincoln to let the black man fight. Lincoln was like, what? Put weapons, put rifles in the hands. The people we had enslaved, he was not down with it initially, but they weren't winning. But ultimately, 225,000 black men enlisted in all branches of the Union forces, including then the Merchant Marines, 185,000 enrolled in the Army, and that is literally what turned the tide of the Civil War. But that's not taught. You know, just like it's not taught, you know, they teach that the American Revolution was a rebellion against British imperialism, but the important point that they leave out is that one of the reasons that the colonists